It's Sunday, so once again, it's time for Yodobashi's top 10 camera sales for the entire Japanese market. But this time around, we've got a few twists. The first one, well, we've got the sales data for the entire year of 2022. So grab yourself a fresh cup of coffee or a fresh cup of tea, and let's get right to the details. But first, if you could please do me a favor, if you could follow me on Twitter, if you could subscribe, like, comment, and all that wonderful stuff, it really does help this channel grow. Yodobashi is Japan's largest retailer of digital cameras, among other things, and Yodobashi releases their sales data every 2 weeks. And while this is by no means an indicator of worldwide sales, it's the perfect conversation for a Sunday morning. Just a few moments ago in the intro, I said we have a couple of twists. The first one is that instead of having sales data for the last 2 weeks, we actually have the sales data for the entire year of 2022. And the other twist? Well, instead of the top 10, we've actually got the top 20. So without further ado, let's take a look at position number 20. In 20th place, we have a Sony full-frame camera, the a7 III, a camera that's been out for many years and was actually succeeded by the Sony a7 IV back in December of 2021. In 19th place, we have a Canon APS-C camera, the Canon EOS R7 that was released back in June of 2022. So this camera's only been out in the market for about 6 months, but most of that time, it's been showing up in the Yodobashi top 10. The Sony Alpha 1, Sony's flagship mirrorless camera that was announced back in January in 2021, makes an appearance here in 18th place. But it isn't performing as well as other flagship cameras such as the Nikon Z9 or arguably the Canon R3, although it's definitely doing better than the Canon 1DX Mark III. The Canon EOS R10, released alongside the Canon EOS R7, shows up in 17th place, and it's in the kit form with the 18-150 image stabilized STM. Released in July 2020, the Canon R6 takes 16th place in the kit form with a 24-105. And the R6 Mark I has done, well, rather well since it was introduced back in 2020, quite often showing up in the Yodobashi top 10 and also performing very well in North America, Europe, and Asia. But recently, Canon announced back in November the 1st, the Canon EOS R6 Mark II for the exact same price as the Mark I 2.5 years ago. $24.99, the same price. However, since the introduction of the R6 Mark II, the R6 Mark I can be found for $100 to $200 less. What's big about the R6 Mark II, while it gets a slight bump in resolution from 20 to 24 megapixels, for us video shooters, well, Canon's fixed a whole lot of problems, and we even got false colors. So much fewer problems with overheating, better record times, and false colors. Wow, false colors on a Canon camera. That's not a cinema camera. That's something to celebrate. The Sony ZV-E10 takes 15th place. It's a solid camera at a good price point and excellent for those who enjoy vlogging and don't have a large budget. A solid successor to the ZV-1 and much better than that Sony ZV-1F. I really don't know what Sony was planning with that thing. I mean, seriously, contrast detect autofocus in a budget camera? Not even Panasonic does that anymore. In 14th place, we have the Sony a7 III. And no, that isn't a mistake. You'll notice it's in 20th place too, right there. But take a look at the fine print. It's actually in kit form, and we're talking about separate SKUs. If a camera sold in kit form and body form, it is possible to show up in the top 10 in more than one SKU. So even though this camera's been on the market for several years, it's still performing very well. The Nikon Z50 kit was released back in October 2019, but still manages to take 13th place, just under the OM Systems OM1. The OM1 is a very good crop-censored camera, a go-anywhere, any environment camera with solid stills and video capabilities. And while launched at the same time as the Panasonic GH6, Panasonic is shut out of the Yodobashi's top 20. In 11th place, we have the Sony a6400, not a full-frame camera, an APS-C camera, but another camera that's been out for more than 2 years. And you're going to see a bit of a trend here in the top 20 cameras of 2022. We're seeing a lot of cameras that have been out for at least 2 years, and the a6400 is no exception. It's a very popular camera and has a lot of great features, but I don't know, the a6400 when the a6500 is out there, which one would you prefer? Which one do you own? Let me know in the comment section down below. Canon takes the number 10 spot with the Canon EOS R3, a substitute for the R1. And while not Canon's official flagship camera, it has many capabilities exceeding the 1DX Mark III. And while a solid camera, many are still holding onto their DSLRs, the 1DX Mark III, the 1DX Mark II, and other 1 series cameras waiting for something a little bit more. And while the R3 does have some firsts for a digital camera like eye-controlled autofocus at $59.99, it's not really exciting enough to get many patiently waiting for the Canon EOS R1. A camera, according to sources at Canon Rumours, says will be a master of everything. In 9th place, we have another Nikon, the Nikon ZFC with a 16 to 50 millimeter. In 8th place, we have the Canon EOS RP kit with a 24 to 105. The Canon EOS RP is the cheapest by far full-frame camera on the market for $999. And over Christmas, this camera went on sale for $899. But this camera is showing its age. It was released back in March of 2019 and is in desperate need of a refresh. In 7th place, we have the Sony a7 IV. This camera is selling very well. I can't believe how well this camera's performed since it started shipping in December of 2021. A full-frame camera for $24.99. It's always been in the top 10. In fact, most of the times that Yodobashi's been publishing their numbers, the Sony a7 IV has been in the top 3. But that's not all. Despite showing up in 1st and 3rd place, it also shows up in 2 SKUs, one body alone and one in kit form. In 6th place, we have the Sony a7S III, another camera that's been on the market for, well, more than 2 years. Released back in August 2020, making us wait a total of 5 years after the release of the Sony a7S II, a solid video-centric camera, only overshadowed by the FX3, which shows up in 5th place with a slightly higher sticker price at $38.99. And if you're considering the Sony a7 IV, you really ought to take a serious look at the FX3. But if the price of $38.99 is much higher than you're budgeting, well then perhaps you should consider the FX30, some $700 less than the a7 IV at $17.98. In 4th place, we have the Canon EOS R6, a camera that when it came out was, well, nicknamed the Mini 1DX Mark III. On the still side of things, this is a solid camera. In low light performance, in studio shooting, at 20 frames per second, it's 10 frames per second more than the Sony a7 IV, priced at $24.99, the same price as the Canon EOS R6. So it's no surprising that the Canon EOS R6 has done well since it was released back in July of 2020, selling for $24.99 and quite often showing up in the Yodobashi top 10. Only now has it been succeeded by the Canon EOS R6 Mark II. The Nikon Z9 takes the number 3 spot in the Yodobashi top 20 cameras sold in 2022. Kind of makes you wonder how well the Nikon Z8 would do, a mini Nikon Z9, if Nikon would release it today. Would the Nikon Z8 shoot to the top of the charts? I certainly think so. The Nikon Z8 doesn't have a whole lot of competition. It has the Canon EOS R5, a camera that was released back in July of 2020, and of course the Sony a7 R5, a camera that was released back at the end of October, beginning of November. Both cameras are solid competition for the would-be Nikon Z8. The Canon EOS R5 has been hard to find throughout much of its 2.5-year life. Canon did such a good job of this camera that when it was released back in July of 2020, it's been, well, hard to find for much of its first 2 years. And even today, there are some places having trouble sourcing this camera. It's always been in the Yodobashi top 10 and most of the times in the top 5. And for a camera that sells at $38.99, it's pretty impressive. Canon with the R5 did leapfrog the competition. They were the first stills hybrid camera to do 8K video, not 8K IPB, not 8K all-I, but 8K RAW at up to 30 frames per second, 24, 25, and 30 frames per second. It could also do 8K oversample 4K, beating out the Sony a7S III up to 30 frames per second. The R5 could also do 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second in 4K. And with Canon Log 3, and on the still side of this camera, 20 frames per second electronic, it's hard not to like this camera. And with Canon sort of just, well, barely moving along with the 5D Mark IV and other cameras, when the 5D Mark IV came out, it was seen as, well, not nearly as good as the competition. Canon didn't have IBIS, they didn't have 4K, and whatever they did put out 4K in, like the 5D Mark IV, well, it was cropped. So the Canon EOS R5 with IBIS, with autofocus that works in all video modes, including 8K RAW at 30 frames per second, it's not surprising that this camera is in the number 2 spot. But which camera's in the number 1 spot? Released back in December of 2021, I had no idea that this camera would sell so well. In fact, just looking at Yodobashi numbers since December of 2021, most of the times, the Sony a7 IV body alone has shown up in the top 3, with the kit form no more than, well, 3 to 4 places below it. It's arguably the best-selling camera in Japan, and outside of Japan, in North America, Europe, and Asia, well, the rest of Asia besides Japan, well, the Sony a7 IV is a very good, very top-selling camera, and a camera that Sony and many of its customers are proud of. So recapping the top 20 Yodobashi camera sales for 2022, Sony dominates with 9 camera placements or 9 camera SKUs, and Canon, well, not too bad in second place with 7 camera SKUs. And Nikon shows up with 3, and OM Systems showing up with a single camera. The OM Systems OM1 is a solid camera, a micro four thirds camera that's very good at stills. It's a go anywhere, any environment camera that has some pretty good video features. Not as good as the Panasonic GH6, but if you'll notice that the top 20, there wasn't a single Panasonic camera in the list. Pretty surprising. But with Panasonic's new autofocus system, I wouldn't be surprised if that changes for 2023. Will we see the Panasonic S5 Mark II in the top 20? Or what about the Panasonic refresh of the S1 or the S1H? But the big question is, are we getting a refresh of the S1 or the S1H? Or what about the Canon EOS R5 Mark II? If rumors are to be correct, the Canon EOS R5 Mark II is going to have all the capabilities of what we were expecting Canon to put in the Canon EOS R1. And then, of course, Nikon, we're expecting so many cameras. Perhaps a Z50 refresh. What about the Z6 Mark III, the Z7 Mark III, or even the Nikon, or even the Nikon Z8? I think 2023 is going to be an exciting year. I just put out a video about Nikon's roadmap for their lenses. We're expecting 8 lenses from Nikon alone. And of course, now that we have Tamron and Sigma producing third-party lenses for the platform for the Z mount, I think it looks to be an exciting year, potentially an exciting year for Nikon. It's just, can they deliver? Can they answer the 2.5-year-old Canon EOS R5, the Sony a7 R5, the FX3, the FX30? There's a lot of cameras that have come out since Nikon released the Z6 and Z7, and even the Nikon Z9. There's many holes in Nikon's lineup. If you want to stay up to date on the latest camera news and rumors, go ahead and do yourself a favor. Click that subscribe button, followed by choosing all notifications. And also follow me on Twitter. A lot of news stories that aren't big enough to put out a video, I put them out on Twitter. And if I ever see some deals coming across my desk from B&H and others, really good deals, I also tweet them out on Twitter as well. I get it if you don't like Twitter. I really didn't care for it much. But you know what? There's one thing that YouTube doesn't do well. It doesn't allow me to put out multiple stories. And yes, in the community, I can put out information. But you see, I'm kind of limited to 3 posts a day. I can put out 3 videos. I can put out 3 polls. Or I can do a combination of the 3 or post images. But once I put out more than 3, well, YouTube stops letting people know. So yeah, I'm just limiting YouTube for what it does well, producing videos, no more than 3 a day. And if you want to stay up to date on all the latest news and rumors, you want to subscribe to my YouTube channel, but also follow me on Twitter. But that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. And if you're interested in purchasing any of the cameras mentioned in the top 20 here today, I've got links to B&H and Amazon down below. I'm not saying you have to purchase there. I always recommend purchasing from your local camera shop if you can. But if you are purchasing through B&H and Amazon.com, please use my links because I get about 1% to 2% back. And that goes right back into helping this channel grow. My next camera purchases I'm planning on picking up the Canon EOS R5 Mark II, the R1, and I'm keeping a close eye on Panasonic. I really like what they've done with their autofocus system. After years of us complaining about a phase detect autofocus system, this new autofocus system for the Panasonic S5, well, it looks really solid, the S5 Mark II. I'm really happy with, this is a really good showing. And yes, there are some issues, but I suspect with a few more firmware updates, I think it's going to be just as good as Canon and Sony. And according to some YouTubers that have this camera in hand, they're saying, you know, it's not far off Canon and Sony. Some are even saying that it's slightly better than Sony. But either way, it's a very solid entry. The only person that has to really watch out, or the only company that has to keep an eye out on things right now, is Nikon, because it looks like Panasonic might have a slightly better autofocus system than Nikon. So what will the Z6 Mark III, Z7 Mark III, and Z8 bring? Well, I suspect it's going to have a new and improved, well, a much more improved autofocus system in those 3 cameras. But that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. Have yourself a great Sunday. We'll see you again soon.